Tonight is a night where we celebrate God with us, Emmanuel. And I've mentioned several times now, and we've mentioned several times traditions. And I have a lot of traditions. One of my favorite, my family got to do right before we came tonight. We got to sit and we watch A Christmas Carol every year. I collect them. I have as many versions as I can find. I found a couple new ones this year that I've got to go find and add to my collection. But it's a tradition that began for me as a kid. I had an old radio that was my dad's radio, one of those old tube radios. And before I would go off to sleep, I would run to my room right about 11 o'clock. KMBR from San Francisco would play the Campbell Soup Radio Theater Christmas Carol. And that was my tradition growing up. I grew up in Washington, but my radio picked up the San Francisco station. And that's what I would go to bed to every night. This year, my daughter, my oldest one, was like, "Dad, do you remember when you used to read that story to us every Christmas?" And I went, "No, I never read that story to you every Christmas." We would when she was little, we would lay under the Christmas tree and listen to that as she would go off to sleep. And it's just one of our family traditions. But traditions have some purpose and meaning. They're not just there for us to have fun and enjoy because we do it all the time. They're a tool, they're an instrument to teach us, to help us remember. And out of that, the conversations that I get to have with my kids, even this year as we watch the Christmas Carol and the new revelations that have always been there but are new to them. And they talk about, "Oh, but I see this," and the gift and the joy and the hope that comes. And so we every year have these Christmas traditions, and every year we read the Christmas story. And this year during Advent, we've been preaching through the gifts of the wise men, the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And we've looked at those gifts and how each one of them represents something different about this Christ that came. But tonight we really celebrate the gift of the baby himself. He came to live among us. This God who created, this God who made everything, who is beyond our comprehension, came to live among us. And sometimes that's hard for us to comprehend. It was hard for them to comprehend. We read in the Christmas story about Joseph, and I'm just going to read that little passage in Matthew 18 through 25, and Joseph is a little confused in this. Matthew 18 through 25 says, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, and before they had come together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, 'Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for he will save the people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said in the prophets, saying, 'Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel,' which means God with us. Joseph woke from his sleep, and he did as the angel commanded. He took his wife, and he knew her not until she had given birth to her son, and they called his name Jesus." Joseph is this average, run-of-the-mill guy. In fact, he may have even been kind of in trouble. When we look at some history and things like that, we ask some questions. Why was he not in his hometown? Why did he have to travel? And where did he travel from? He was in Nazareth. That gives us some indication that he may have actually been there working in the rock quarries. We know Joseph as a carpenter But in those days, a carpenter was kind of like a mason. It wasn't quite our woodworking carpenters that we think of today. Here was this guy, this average guy who's hard at work, preparing to start a family, and all of a sudden, this turmoil comes. And how do you explain that the woman you are marrying is now pregnant, but you haven't been together? It's hard to wrap our head around, and how do I explain that to someone? How do I say what this is all really about? Well, it's God come down, and God did this, and sometimes Joseph struggled, I think, to know what to do, but he heard the word of the Lord, and he said, okay, I'll do that. Because it was the very thing that brings us this understanding. This baby was to be the embodiment of God with us. God is not something we can easily comprehend. Who God is and what God does is beyond our comprehension often. And even this idea of God living as one of us can sometimes be hard for us to grasp. What does that mean? What does it look like? What's the purpose of it? How is this a gift to us? The gift to us is that we can see it in our form. We can understand it from our perspective. We can know God because we see it through the physical representation of another human being. One of my other traditions, I'm old enough. How many of you remember Paul Harvey? Right? Remember Paul Harvey's Christmas story? This was Paul Harvey's Christmas story. I'm going to tell you about a man who was not a Scrooge. He was a kind and mostly decent man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with other men, but he just didn't believe in all of that incarnation stuff that the church proclaimed at Christmas, this God with us. It didn't make sense. He was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just couldn't swallow this Jesus story about God becoming a man and living on earth. He told his wife, I'm truly sorry to distress you, but I'm not going with you to the Christmas Eve service at church. He said I would feel like a hypocrite, that he would rather just stay at home, but he would wait up for the family so that they could, so he stayed and waited for the midnight service to end. Shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. As the snow fell, he went to the window and watched the flurries get heavier and heavier. And then he went back to his fireside chair and sat and began to read the newspaper. Minutes later, he heard a startling thud at the window, and then another and another. At first, he thought somebody must be throwing snowballs against the living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled outside miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm, and they were desperately seeking shelter. They had tried to fly through the window, the large landscape window. That is what had been making the large sound. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures just lie there and freeze. So he remembered the barn where he had his children's pony stabled. That would provide warm shelter. All he would need to do is direct the birds into the shelter. Quickly, he put on his coat and his galoshes, and he tramped through the deepening snow. He opened the barn doors and turned on the lights so that the birds would know the way in. But the birds didn't come in. So he figured that food might entice them. He hurried back to the house, fetched some breadcrumbs, sprinkled them in the snow, making a trail of breadcrumbs in the yellow light of the window door of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs. The birds continued to flap about helplessly in the snow. He tried to catch them, but he couldn't catch them. He tried to shoo them into the barn by walking and waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction except into the warm, lighted barn. And that's when he realized they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am this strange, terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me. That I'm not trying to hurt them, but I'm trying to help them. But how? How can I? And any move that he intended to help them, frightened them, confused them, they just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. He thought to himself, if only I could be a bird and mingle with them and speak their language, then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to a safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so they could see, so that they could hear, and so that they could understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. As the sound reached his ears above the sound of the wind, he stood there listening to the carols, the glad tidings of Christmas. And he sank to his knees in the snow. One of Paul Harvey's favorite stories to tell every Christmas. This is the wonder of this child, Emmanuel, God with us. How often do we fear God? How often do we see this God and not comprehend him? But when we see the face of Jesus, the love, the hope, the peace, the joy that comes because we got to know God through this child. This is what Christmas is about. This is the long-awaited gift that God is giving us, this Christ child. Join us as we continue to worship this King.